The History of Scotland. Part 4. The Horsemen. Since before there was anyone to write it down, to as late as the 16th century, there was an inevitable pattern to civilization on the Eurasian supercontinent. Spanning from the Polish plains in the west to Manchuria on the Chinese and Korean fringes in the east, there lies the world's largest continuous grassland, the Eurasian steppe. Here, an alternative style of living has been practiced for thousands of years. Rather than farm crops, like the people of the Fertile Crescent, these people have practiced the herding of animals assisted by their horses. These people represent an alternative path humanity could have taken, in a way being supercharged hunter-gatherers. Unlike with the hunter-gatherers, however, when these steppe nomads encountered a settled farming people, the steppe people were not always pushed back. Instead, these healthier, fitter and stronger people, with their horses and their bows that they could fire from horseback, as well as the numbers of their warriors that were often equivalent to or greater than anything the settled people could muster, generally won against the settled people. It was not usually land that these people were after. After all, land in the Eurasian steppe is rarely a concern. Instead, these people were usually a menace on the edge of civilized society, being anything from a minor concern to an uncivilized terror. The Akkadians in Mesopotamia, writing 1,000 years after our story begins, called these people the Manda, meaning the horde from God knows where. Yet sometimes, on rare occasions, perhaps every few hundred years, when the right set of factors lined up, these people went from a relatively minor menace that did not cause an existential threat to a force that would crush civilizations. Sometimes they were forced off their own land by climate change. Sometimes they were starving due to failures in the relatively unpredictable food supply, and other times they were drawn in by the wealth of settled people. The following is an account from Mesopotamia of the invasion of these people around 1,000 years after the start of our story. Unfortunately, the document containing the account is slightly damaged, and so when there is a word or phrase that is unknown, I shall simply say unknown. They rode in the shining mountains, and the soldier seized them, but they struck their thighs. At the beginning of their approach, they advanced against Purushanda. Purushanda was wholly scattered. Palu was wholly scattered. Indeed, unknown. The powers of the horde from God knows where are unknown. The camps of Shubatenlil. And in the midst of Subartu, all of them roamed. They scattered those in the seas and approached the land of Elam. They scattered Elam and reached the plains. They killed those at the crossing and cast them into the sea. Delmun, Makan, Meluha, in the midst of the sea, as many as there were they killed. 17 kings, with 90,000 of their troops, as with them had come to their aid. Thus was born the cycle of Eurasia. The settled people would build up an advanced and rich civilization, and then the steppe riders would come in and take the wealth and ravage the land. Afterwards, sometimes the steppe riders would settle on the land they took, merging their culture with that of the native peoples there. And other times they would set up kingdoms, but quickly get subsumed into the native culture. Other times, when they came in small numbers, they would melt away, mixing with the local people and disappearing within a generation or two. No matter how they did it, however, they would almost always become themselves settled people, and then targeted by yet more steppe people when the cycle repeated. Thus was born the cycle of Eurasia, and it repeats again and again and again. The Huns, the Hephthalites, the Xiongnu, the Magyar, the Avars, the Pechenegs, the Turks, the Mongols, the Timurids, the Mughals, the Kyrgyz, and the Manchu, and many, many more. In this chapter, our story concerns the very first time that this happened. Somewhere, probably on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, in 3300 BC, a new people were emerging. These are the first people in our story that we really understand. It was probably them or their recent ancestors who had domesticated the horse. They used wheeled wagons and buried their dead under mounds of earth, covering them in red pigment. They may have worn tattoos and painted their skin. They were a warlike people with an expansionist bent who did not back down from a fight. They were likely ruled over by powerful chiefs that they called regs, who the people swore oaths to, and these regs passed their titles from father to son, and like the people of Mesopotamia, the sons stayed in the same household, and the daughters entered a new one upon marriage. It was likely this culture that invented the dowry that is practiced across the world, for it was them who spread it. They herded cattle, likely descended from the aurochs of Anatolia. They believed in both the sacred and the taboo, both of which were intertwined. They may have worshipped the bears as an embodiment of their powerful gods, and would rarely use the word bear, which they called Erkto, instead preferring to use euphemisms such as the one who eats honey or the brown one. They believed in one ultimate god, a father in the sky. They believed in a god of the moon and a goddess of the sun that likely travelled through the sky on chariots, and they believed in a powerful thunder god. We call them the Yamnaya, though they probably called themselves the Veneti. They are the ancestors, at least partially, of all modern ethnic Europeans, North and Central Indians, Iranians, and most Central Asians, for they were the Proto-Indo Europeans, the people who first used the group of languages that would one day be spoken by the majority of the world. Around 3100 BC, these people began the fateful series of migrations that would shape the future of the world, travelling south into Anatolia, southwest into the Balkans, east into the Tocharian Basin, and southeast into Iran and later India. The branch we are concerned about went west. By about 3050 BC, they had slammed up against the people descended from the Middle Eastern farmers in what is today Poland and Germany, destroying much of the culture that they had left behind. The genetics of the culture left in their wake indicate that 75% of their ancestry had come from the Yamnaya people rather than the Middle Eastern hunter-gatherers. By 2900 BC, the situation had settled down, and like how always happens, the steppe riders themselves became sedentary and adopted a lifestyle mostly based on farming. The culture they formed was called the corded ware culture, on account of the unique pottery that they produced. While these steppe people had somewhat settled down, they were still a warlike and expansionist people, and over a longer period pushed west into France, where they merged with the local people there and formed the people that we today call the Bell Beaker people, on account of the unique beakers found in their graves. With the migration, the steppe people had increased the process that was already going on to an extent. While they still had plenty of tools made from bone, antler and stone, the Yamnaya brought with them widespread use of copper wherever they went, though in Central Europe this may have started before them. Copper is very much not bronze. While better for most purposes than alternative materials, it is a weak metal that easily distorts and struggles to keep an effective edge. As such, it was not often used for weapons, either for hunting or for war, but instead was more used for tools, such as axes for felling, chisels and pickaxes for quarrying and mining, and knives for utility work. Particularly though, this strange new metal was used for jewellery and adornments, pins, brooches, charms, rings and bracelets. A new culture developed throughout the copper-using world of much more adornments and what we might today see as a more vain and flashy society. And along with copper also came the use of gold. Very small quantities of gold had been used probably since the last ice age. This is because it is a highly unreactive metal, and so unlike almost all other metals, it appears in its native form naturally, rather than as an ore, which would take a complicated physical process to extract the metal. With increased knowledge from copper working, however, gold working became increasingly complicated and began being used more and more by the social elite. It was these Bell Beaker people from France who first brought large-scale metalworking to the British Isles. Beginning around 2500 BC, these people began arriving first in the south of England and then in eastern Scotland in what is now Aberdeenshire, with different and diverse groups of these Bell Beaker Indo Europeans bringing their cultural variations with them into this new land. Then, possibly around 100 years later, they arrived in Ireland, likely on the south coast in a separate migration from the continent. Thus began the British Age of Copper, the Chalcolithic. Defining this period as the Chalcolithic, though, is controversial. This is because, while in places like the Levant, the Chalcolithic may have lasted as long as 4,500 years, beginning possibly as early as the very last years of the Ice Age. As we will see, the British Chalcolithic lasted only a few hundred. For a long time, it was thought the population remained generally quite unchanged, and that the process of adapting this new culture and language of the Bell Beaker people was fueled mostly by trade and cultural exchange. But we now know this to be untrue. Genetic studies estimate that around 90% of the population of the British Isles was replaced by these migrants. Exactly how, we do not know. The obvious thought is that there was a violent conquest, but it may also have been that they brought with them diseases from the Eurasian steppe that the native people had little resistance to. This could have been due to the Yamnaya having over 1,000 years of contact with domesticated horses, and having many instances of diseases being transmitted from the horses to the Yamnaya and their descendants. However, recorded in ancient Irish mythology, there may be an indication that at least some of the migration was violent. Written down in the 11th century by Christian monks, the Luala Guala Ern, or Book of the Conquest of Ireland, chronicles the pre-Christian oral history of Ireland. Found within its pages are a people called the Fomor, who are sometimes portrayed as supernatural beings, and other times as savage sea raiders or giants. But reading between the lines, it now seems this may have been a reference to the cultures that the Bell Beaker people encountered when first migrating to Ireland. The exonym Fomor is difficult to translate, probably originating from a pre-Irish Celtic language, but it may have had some connection to either the underworld or the sea with its possible meanings. It is likely a compound, with fo probably meaning underneath, but mor being more difficult to translate. It may have been connected to the Indo European cognate mori and its cognate mori in Proto-Celtic, meaning a body of water or sea. so they could be translated as the people from beneath the sea or water. This may be a relation to other ideas of the other world being reachable through bodies of water that appear in the mythology of the Bell Beaker people in the British Isles, all the way to the modern Celts. So a different translation with this in mind might be the supernatural people, or possibly more sinisterly, the devils. Another translation of Moor would make it more connected to the Proto-Celtic cognate Mor, meaning big or great. So it would be the under-great people, or the people beneath the greats, or indeed the inferior people. No matter what it is though, the name eludes us, and too much time has passed now for a definitive answer. In later Irish Christian mythology, they were said to be demonic, with bodies of men and the head of a goat, connecting them to the ideas of Satan and his demons. But in those few older myths that survive to us, they are instead said to be darkly handsome humans, and many of them intermarry with the old gods of Ireland, the Thu De, divine tribe. This record of a darker people who fought and were defeated by the ancestors of the Irish as they migrated from the continent, and eventually intermarried with the settlers, seems to be a tantalising hint at the folk memory of the Indo European migrations. In the Annala Reacta Éireann, they record a battle between the first Irish and the Fomor. In this year, the first battle was fought in Ireland. Crícil Gregan Usa, son of Gaul, son of Garu, of the Fomor, and his mother, came into Ireland, 800 in number, so that a battle was fought between them and the Irish at Slona Moya Ea, where the Fomor were defeated by Partholon, so that they were all slain. This is called the Battle of Moya Ea. The date for this battle is given as either 2618 AM or 2608 AM, depending on the source used, which in our calendar would be 2580 to 2590 BC. If this was accurate, this would be at the very earliest point at which the Bell Beaker Indo-European peoples may have been making first contact with Ireland. If this truly is a half-remembered folk memory of days long since gone by, or if it is simply mythology with a strange resemblance to the truth is anyone's guess. But it should be remembered that from across the world, from Greece to Australia, archaeology is beginning to vindicate previously disregarded folk history. If we are for a second to believe that this account is genuine, then the Irish legends raise an interesting possibility that would likely not have been noticed in purely archaeological record. And this is that the Fomor remained in isolated pockets for hundreds or possibly even 1,000 years before being forcibly assimilated into pre-Irish society. Over time though, the Fomor legends become more and more clearly supernatural, with many of the later myths of the Fomor having clearly no basis in history, with earlier stories showing them more as people, and later ones showing them more and more as demonic and otherworldly, eventually becoming the enemies of the gods of pre-Christian Ireland. Yet despite this possible evidence of conflict when the Indo Europeans first settled, something strange is shown in the archaeological record. The standing stones and the great Neolithic religious sites were largely continued, as far as we can tell, in a generally similar role. Though we do not know what they meant to the newcomers, any more than what they meant to the Neolithic peoples. It may have been that the religion of the native people was important to the newcomers, and that they respected and adopted parts of it. It may simply have been that they respected the knowledge of the Neolithic peoples, recognising their mastery over the land and intimate knowledge of how to live here, or simply that as a frontier people, the Indo Europeans respected the natives, adopting much of their folklore, as their distant descendants the Europeans would do on the American frontier 4,300 years later. It may also have been, as is indicated in the tales of the Fomor, that the Indo Europeans may have seen the Neolithic peoples as at least partially supernatural. Yet despite their relative integration with at least some aspects of the native people in Britain, much still changed, renovating and changing aspects of many ancient Neolithic monuments, such as the raising of the great blue stones of Stonehenge, changing the appearance to that of the structure seen in a modern day. It was near Stonehenge, in the south of England, that the body of a man was found in 2002. He was easily identifiable as a member of the Bell Beaker culture and was dated to a few hundred years after the migration, likely dying around 2300 BC. He is known as the Amesbury Archer, due to the 16 flint arrowheads he was buried with, but it was more likely in life that he was a blacksmith. Being buried was what was likely his anvil and 3 small copper knives. Based on his burial, it seems that he was important to the people of Stonehenge. For a time it was suggested that he was some kind of a king. Today it seems more likely that his ability to work metal made him a magician some kind in the eyes of the Bell Beaker people of prehistoric Britain. It was somewhat surprising, therefore, when archaeologists tested the enamel of his teeth and found that he was not from Britain at all, but instead was likely born in northern Germany, showing that these Yamnaya descended peoples across Europe still maintained close connections to their cultural relatives. It was only in the most remote regions of Europe that the last of the Neolithic farmers held on. Though over time they merged culturally to the newcomers and intermarried, eventually coming to see each other as one and the same. Though we are not sure how long this took, merely that it happened by the time that Scotland truly drags itself into the full historic era in the 11th century. And just like for the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers that went before them, Scotland and its harsh landscape proved a sanctuary for the old world once again, while others lived on in the Welsh mountains and far remote regions of Ireland, as well as on the continent in the Basque country. Today this can be reflected in the sometimes slightly Middle Eastern appearance of certain people in these remote regions, them being a last echo of the phenotypes of the Neolithic farmers. It is these Beaker people, the descendants of the Yamnaya, who mixed with the Neolithic peoples of Germany, France and Poland, and again with what remained of the Neolithic peoples of the British Isles, who are today the ancestors of almost all of those who live here and are not the descendants of recent immigrants. Never again would there be a migration of quite the same impact. From here, the population of the British Isles was in many ways set, being influenced far less by subsequent migrations. The population of the Beaker people then exploded above anything seen previously in the Neolithic age, possibly reaching anything from 500,000 to 250,000 people by 2000 BC. With this, the land was divided up into a much more organised field system, likely with a much more robust hierarchy in place, to try and mitigate conflict caused by land stress. It is in this period where we start to see evidence of a new religious practice, that being sacrifice. Evidence of the casting away of expensive or difficult to produce items begins around this time, as well as the sacrifice of animals. A worrying side of this tradition is the first appearance of human sacrifice. Like many ancient cultures, it seems there was some form of a deal between the nobility and the common people, where the common people would support the lifestyle of the nobility, and the nobility would defend them both from people and from the wrath of the gods. When the nobility failed to do this, it seems that they were forcibly sacrificed to the gods of these people as a last plea for salvation. Though it should be noted that the difference between a holy sacrifice and a lynching by the mob may only have been one of perspective. An example of this is found in County Laois. Named Cashel-Man, his body was found in what was a prehistoric lake and dated to 2000 BC, several hundred years after the arrival of the Bell Beaker people. He had his arm broken, likely by an axe or a primitive sword, possibly in an attempt to resist his fate. Shortly after his broken arm, he was held down and his spinal cord was severed, again with an axe or a sword, before his back was broken in 2 places. This is also indicative of a new idea, that of moving away from megalithic stone architecture as their spiritual sites, and moving instead to bodies of water and lakes. An idea that has survived to this very day. In the next chapter, we will deal with the changes that the arrival of bronze brought, as well as the development of the Bell Beaker civilization.